Now for something completely different. Here's Sam Creamer talking about William Hymes's flugel solo, So Glad.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us on Fully Scored. A real pleasure to be speaking to you from the other side of the world via the magic of Zoom. Are you keeping well?
Mate, I am keeping very well. Very hot over here at the moment. I believe, how hot was it for you today, Matthew?
Oh, well, I'm absolutely sweating with about 4 degrees Celsius here, so it's
4 degrees Celsius. Well,
yeah.
I can do you about 30 degrees better over here.
Nice.
In the positives, not the negatives. Definitely t-shirt and short weather.
Oh, yeah, just making us very jealous there. So let's move on swiftly, shall we? So we're going to be speaking about Bill Himes' iconic, I would say, now flugel solo, So Glad. So just a few contextual questions before we delve into the score. For you, when did you first come across this piece and discover it?
I probably came across it when I was actually depping for another core band concert. I would say that's probably only been in the last 5 or 6 years. You know, I'm probably a little bit behind the times on this one, considering it was written in 1983. But definitely I had heard of it a lot. I've heard that, it's a ripper swing piece. It's a flugelhorn solo. It's a Bill Himes chart. It ticks all the boxes. I hadn't had a chance to play it yet. I first probably downloaded a recording of it. The first recording I probably downloaded was the Melbourne staff band recording with James Morrison playing the lead. I've got a couple on my playlist at the moment. And yes, definitely after I've come across this piece of music and played it a few times, it sort of sticks with you. And for a chart that was written in 1983, that's pretty good, really.
Absolutely. So, I can't quite believe it, but 40 years ago this year, it was published. I believe when it first got taken to Music Council, it was actually rejected because it was too out there, too modern for Salvation Army music. How do you feel about that, knowing how Salvation Army music is today?
The interesting thing to note about the Salvation Army publishing at this particular time, 1980s, swing and big band music has been around since the 1920s, 1930s. And it even says in the notes is it's written similar to a big band style of the 1930s. So my honest opinion here is the Salvation Army is a little bit behind the times. If the actual style of the piece had been around for 50 years before it was published, and it's taken that long for maybe not even just Salvation Army bands, but brass bands in general to actually breach the contemporary swing jazz style idiom.
And this piece of music, anyone that knows your music will know that you have a real talent for writing in a big band and jazz style, although, of course, not exclusively. Has this work in any way had an impact on the way that you write at all?
I would probably say yes. Obviously, as we've just alluded to, this was quite possibly and probably the first swing piece of music to be published by the Salvation Army. This paved the way for future generations of writers. It paved the way for future generations of musicians in Salvation Army bands. And not just that, it also paved the way for listeners. What will be received by this genre of brass band, what will be perceived, particularly with this style of music, how is it received outdoors in the public? How is it received beyond the four walls of the church? This is for me, and with a lot of what I do, with the way I like to write in a way that catches anybody's attention, not just using a Salvation Army tune that everybody within the four walls seems to know very well and love, but for those outside the walls, when we go down the street with the Army band or into the contest realm, how do we grab the attention of everybody else that's not army or doesn't have a faith? How do we get their attention? It's a real outreach and an evangelism tool. For me, that's what sticks, and that's what this piece really paved the way for.
Some really interesting points there. Thank you for that. So, I'm sure you'll be so glad to know we're going to delve into the score now and have a look through at what Bill does with the dots here. So, let's start at the beginning, because that seems to make fairly logical sense. What can you tell us about this introduction here?
Well, I think the first thing we need to look at here, Matthew, like I sort of alluded to, before we play a note, the conductor probably needs to look at the score notes. In approaching this piece of music, as a conductor in 1983, which I wasn't, but for conductors out there that were a little bit apprehensive about this, and Leslie Condon wrote the score notes. And they weren't even really performance notes as such. They were just, how do we get this into the genre? You know, some of his points said it may well not be that all Salvationist ears are yet ready to receive music in this style. It also goes on to say the serious music lover regarded such expressions with suspicion and even open hostility, but we are now surely at a place in music evolution where we must recognise the spurs which this art form has won, quite apart from the matters of personal taste. It even goes on to say that perhaps it is superfluous to offer technical script in these comments. One must have a natural flair for this music before embarking on the role of the soloist. If a candidate be an absolute straight player, he should probably leave it alone. I don't know about you, but they sound like some pretty blunt comments, and that's before a note's even played. He's got a repetitive rhythmic figure. Now, what this is setting up is not just the style. You know, the thing we need to understand about swing is 1 and 3 don't exist. All of the accents always catch before beat 1 and beat 3. So he set this up really well here within the first, 8 bars of the introduction. He's also got it very heavily articulated. Lots of dots, lots of dashes, lots of accents, lots of witches' hats, as we call them in jazz. If you were to get a scat singer using such syllables as do-be-do-wah, be-do-wah, be-do-wah, if you were to sing that, you'd get the articulation straight up because you're articulating with the syllables that you're actually using. But for brass players, particularly in the age of 1983, he had to spell these articulations out. So this is exactly what he's done here. He's not only introduced the style, he's introduced the articulations, the dynamics that go with that. It's a piano crescendo at the start, bar 1, gradually getting to a double forte by bar 7. And that's pretty textbook. But when you're adding that to the swing genre and the drive behind swing, that's exciting, what he's done here.
So, at letter A, the soloist takes centre stage and gives us our first rendition of the tune, I Am So Glad. What are some of the things that we should be looking or listening out for in section A?
Obviously, with a lot of words that we use in the Salvation Army, we associate them with selections like this. So, why has he used the tune So Glad? I am so glad that our Father in heaven tells of his love in the book he has given. Wonderful things in the Bible I see. This is the dearest that Jesus loves me. I learnt that song probably through Sunday school days, singing company. Very, very early youth is when this song is probably mostly introduced. Traditionally, it's in a 6/8 measure, the tune. But again, he's adapted that into this swing idiom. But the thing is with big band writing, particularly when you're backing a soloist, everything here is pretty well stock standard and written in sections. So whenever one trombone's in, you're all in, sort of thing. And that's what happens in a big band. You don't often get a combination of like one saxophone, one trumpet, one trombone playing together in a block. It's usually section at a time. And that's what was big in the 1930s and 40s with Count Basie's big band. So what you can see here in the trombones is they're all pretty much playing rhythmically in unison. He's got one tuba playing, and the way he's notated that, instead of having like straight crotchets, he's separated the walking line in bar 3 of A into quavers. So he wants daylight in between, as if it was a string bass. Because you got to remember, for this time, 1983, no one's actually read this yet. In the year 2023, we could put dots underneath it, and most tuba lines actually know how to play swing by now. But this is the first time that army bands have actually played swing. The other thing about letter A, where the soloist comes in, I would probably ask myself, well, probably even ask Bill, why the flugelhorn as the soloist? What do you think, Matt?
I guess that warm, mellow, rich sound, very vocal, and probably an instrument that you would find doubling if you were playing in a big band.
The only instruments that are used simultaneously in a brass band and a big band, obviously you have your trombone section. Obviously you have your drum kit, which is another good point, because up until this time, a drum kit probably hasn't been published to be used with an army band yet. So this is probably the first time. I'll come back to that in a second. But the flugelhorn is the only other jazz instrument you would find being used in a big band and a brass band. And at that time, you'd had all these U-boot trumpet players go through, like Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong back in the day, all these brilliant jazz trumpet players coming around, but they always alternated between trumpet and flugelhorn. So flugelhorn was pretty solidified as a jazz instrument by 1983.
So at section C, when the flugel takes over with this improvisatory line, we've got the chords and the jazz chord progression written above the line here. I guess that would be a first for Salvation Army music.
I would say so too. The general improvising rule in big band music, if there's chords written above the soloist line, it basically, the unwritten rule is you have freedom to ad-lib, or if you've got sound chord knowledge of how the chords are built, you could make your own solo. So I guess you could nearly say it's taking a leaf out of the drum kit notation here too as well. Because until this point in time, it's probably assumed that the drum kit hasn't been introduced to brass band music yet. So therefore, all he's really done here for the drum kit part is nearly the same thing in every bar, right? But the assumption is that the kit player is just going to play whatever he thinks fits. And to this day, as a drummer myself, that's what we do. And this is not just an army thing, this is outside in the commercial world as well. Basically, drum kit parts are just like, we're telling you the guide map, we're telling you what style we sort of want. The rest is the world's your oyster. You make it work for us, sort of thing. And so that's going back to the soloist part. This is what jazz improvisation is all about. He had to write a solo in there because it was the first time a jazz solo had been written in our journals, really. So he's got to put something down for someone to play. quite often in the jazz world, with professional bands even, you wouldn't even see a solo there. You'd see a chord progression with 4 slashes in every bar. And that just says, right, your turn to solo, make it up.
So that takes us probably into the midsection of section C, and we've got this interplay here between the band with this syncopated rhythm and the answering flugelhorn on its own. Can you talk us through that section?
It sort of comes across as a bit of this like jazz call and response sort of pattern. This is perfect opportunity here if the flugelhorn player didn't get to play whatever he wanted, because maybe he didn't feel comfortable improvising earlier. He's got a blank bar of absolutely nothing every 2 bars here. So this is perfect opportunity when absolutely nothing else is going on to actually showcase a little bit more of what he can do.
Us to letter D. So we have some stabs and swells from the band, and then a bit of development in the melody from the flugelhorn using the first few notes canonically. Anything else that you'd like to pull out of the score here between letters D and E?
You know, looking at the first 4 bars of D, he's got this double 4/8 shot note from the whole band, and suddenly, you know, not even a breath mark in between. At the speed that we're going, he's expected the whole band to get down to piano, and by the next accented 4 and we're back up to double forte. I don't put it past earlier writers that this hasn't done before, but in the swing idiom, you know, it's just like, how much more can we pack into this? It's like, oh. That took us by surprise. You know, could you imagine being that music camp band or whichever band was first to read this going, oh my gosh, what just happened? He's just packed all of this in, and yet there's so much more coming. He's really tried to put so much in there, yet keeping it so simple. I would nearly say that those 2 bars of letter D, for the band particularly, and it happens again later on, but to this point, that's probably the 2 hardest bars in the whole piece. Coming out of those 2 bars, is he's got this sort of repetitive... He's repeating it up the octave 3 times before the soloist comes back in. You know, that's interesting because that's taking a bit of a leaf out of the classical book that all brass bandies up until this point would be used to playing. That's familiar to them already. You know, it's that familiarity with techniques that have already sort of been used in brass band pieces prior to 1983. The difference is we're playing in a swing style. I think moving on through letter D, you've got all these shot notes and 4/8 pianos from the rest of the band, while the kit and the B-flat bass sort of hold the ground with the style. The rest of the band's either playing shot notes or 4/8 piano chords. But it's very clever how he's done it. To get the definite 4/8 piano sound, the horns and the soprano, the euphonium and the E-flat bass for that matter, they're all playing the same dynamic here. But those that are playing the long notes with the 4/8 pianos, which are the brights, they don't have to work as much on that 4/8 piano. This is just going into the genius that Bill Himes is. He's definitely a work smarter, not harder sort of guy. And the chord progressions that he used here is basically just going down by semitone over a series of, 8 bars, maybe 10, to arrive at the new modulation of D flat. And you're talking about jazz chords. You'd sit in this band rehearsal in 1983 and think, am I playing the wrong note? Have I made a mistake? But realistically, you haven't. It's jazz chords, and with jazz, nearly anything goes. 1983, we're used to the triad chord of, what chord was it we started on? A G minor 9. Your G minor would be a G, B flat, and a D as your basic triad. But to make it a ninth on top of that, you've added the 7th, which would be an F natural, and then the 9th would be an A natural. But the way that that's been created with these chords is you've got your basic triad of G, B flat, D, but basically then with the D you've started a new chord of a D minor on top of the G minor, is what they call chord layering. So essentially the band's playing 2 chords. And definitely as contemporary music and the use of jazz chords have sort of extended over the last 40 years, it's something that a lot of us would be actually quite used to now. But like I said, you can imagine in 1983, when this first came out, how many of the band were thinking, oh, I've got a clash with the first trombone. Solo cornets are playing a B natural, but the lower first trombone is playing a C natural. That's generally, you sort of think, well, that can't be right. But in jazz, it fits in that idiom, something they weren't used to, but this is the way Bill's just introduced this style to brass music again. But yeah, he's basically stepped that down from G minor to arrive at D flat major 9th, 2 bars before E. So it's an interesting modulation that he's used. And it's literally like he's climbing down a set of stairs with semitone drops every way. But the soloist sort of does his thing, but you actually don't realise what's happening until you arrive at the resolve of the D flat major 9.
Funky and fruity in equal measure. So, at section E, we have a development of the original opening motif. What are some of the things that you could extrapolate from the score here?
Interesting thing to note here is probably more dynamics. The rest of the band has basically diminished from, mezzo forte, 2 bars before E, right down to a double piano on the downbeat of E. But the cornets are coming in at forte. That's a pretty dramatic change if your band's playing that properly. Because by the time you get maybe a beat out of bar E on beat 4 of the bar before, your band's probably playing it about piano, right? And suddenly the cornets come in blazing. Ba ba da ba ba da ba ba da ba. Bill's been a lot more adventurous with some of these jazz chords in the accompaniment here than what he was earlier. If you want to get technical, he's actually broken the classical rule of parallel fourth intervals. And it's right up the band. Harmonically, it's not theoretically correct, but it's jazz. We're allowed to do this in jazz because anything goes, right? So he's got this sort of, he's died it down a little bit. The accompaniment quite quiet. The only thing that really alludes to we've still got somewhere to go from here is when the trombones come in with their... It's a 4-day hit and the rest of the band's not there. I don't think the flugel part's even at 4-day there. Maybe not. The interesting thing here, though, is the trombones have got a glissando fall written on their note. You'd have players looking at that in 1983 going, what is this all about? How do we execute this? Is it a glissando? Well, not really. It's a fall, which means you fall off the note. It doesn't mean you let your slide go all the way down like a traditional Dixieland type glissando. Hit the note and just fall off it. And that's a jazz technique. So how much more jazz stuff can you pack into this? Because, again, the Army's got a little bit to catch up on here. And he's taken all these jazz techniques and put it in this one chart and hit an Army band with it suddenly, and everybody's like, whoa, where did this come from? And if that wasn't enough, segueing into letter F, suddenly we've hit a cabaret style.
And to quote Kevin Larson from a few episodes ago, we have some razzmatazz here, don't we? Letter F.
But this is another element of jazz that he's tried to pack in to this one piece of music. And all of these elements of jazz have not been done before by Salvation Army bands. So you can wonder why this band at the first music camp was like rejecting the work. There was just so much in it that they just weren't used to. I say to a lot of bands, whether I'm playing or leading or whether they're brass bands or big bands or whatever, you know, if So Glad was to end up on your music stands next Wednesday's rehearsal, if you wanted to go and listen to a recording to get the style, while many of the staff bands have done really good recordings of it, if you wanted to capture the authentic jazz big band style that Bill's looking for here, you'd be putting on a Count Basie album and listening to that on repeat. Sure, So Glad won't be in the track listing, but everything that is in So Glad you will pick up from Count Basie and his big band.
So, to wrap things up, the tempo cranks itself up again, and we get to our tempo primo at G to finish off the piece with this quite delicate ending.
The interesting thing about the outro, which is what we would call it in the jazz world, an intro and an outro, it's a play out. Again, with a little bit of tweaking in the scoring, it's basically a cut, copy, paste of the introduction. It's just down a minor third because he's modulated. The main difference here is that the last two bars, but he's stopped on the double 4/8 shot for the whole band and let the flugel take the ba-do-va-do-wah. And that actual figure is what the cornets did earlier. But we don't sort of relate to that because A, it's in a different key, and B, the soloist is playing it. So we sort of think that it's another solo fill. But realistically, it's exactly what the cornets did earlier. So yeah, it's an interesting outro. It's a cut, copy, paste of what we did in the introduction, but that last bar is the very interesting way to end it because it's gone from big to suddenly subtle, cheeky exit.
Cheeky and sneaky indeed. Well, Sam, thank you so much for that really insightful analysis of So Glad, but also the wider sort of use of jazz and those sort of idioms in Salvation Army music. It's been really fascinating to listen to you, and thank you so much for giving your time to join us on Fully Scored.
Thanks for having me.